Hi. In today's class, we will learn how to prepare a flexible budget. Now, before preparing a flexible budget, you need to learn to identify the different types of costs, such as fixed cost, variable cost, and a semi-variable cost. Here are a few guidelines to help you identify these costs. In case of fixed cost, the amount remains the same irrespective of the units of production, but the cost per unit will change with different units of production. In case of a variable cost, the cost per unit will remain the same irrespective of the units of production, and the amount will vary with different sets of units of production. And in case of semi-variable cost, neither will the cost per unit remain the same, nor the total amount will remain the same. For this, there will be a different calculation where you need to find out how much is the proportion of variable cost and how much is the proportion of fixed cost. So let's go ahead and work out a problem on flexible cost. Now here is the question. The expenses budgeted for the production of 10,000 units in a factory are given below. They've given us various costs over here. Now we have to first identify which is fixed, which is variable. Although sometimes they will clearly mention it in the question, you might also need prior knowledge to be able to identify what is fixed and what is variable. They've given us material and labor. Now we need to remember that these are direct expenses. Any direct expense is a variable expense as well. Next, they've clearly mentioned factory overheads is a variable factory overheads cost. And we also have fixed factory overheads cost. In brackets, they've given us the amount which remains the same. Next is direct variable expenses. They've clearly mentioned it's a direct cost. Then we have selling expense, wherein in brackets they've mentioned 10% is fixed. That means the remaining 90% becomes variable. Therefore, we can say that this is a semi-variable expense. Next, we have distribution expense. Here in brackets, they've mentioned 20% is fixed. That means the remaining 80% is variable. This is a semi-variable expense, just like the selling expense. And administration expenses, the amount remains the same. They've mentioned it is fixed at 50,000. The total cost of sales per unit is given to us, and the question says, prepare a budget for the production of 6,000 units. So we're going to be preparing a column for 10,000 units, that is for the information given to us, and we will also be preparing a column for 6,000 units. This is where we have to find out the values at 6,000 units. So this is where we start with a flexible budget. Now, since they've given us factory, admin, and selling and distribution overheads, we will be preparing the budget in a cost sheet format. So in a cost sheet format, you start off with the direct costs to calculate the prime cost. Now, the different types of direct costs are your material, labor, and any other direct expenses given in the question. Now, they have given us material and labor, and they've also given us something called as direct variable expense. So these will be written in the beginning in order to calculate prime cost. Now remember, any direct cost is a variable expense. And what is the rule in case of a variable expense? The cost per unit for a variable expense remains the same, irrespective of the units of production. Now we have a column for cost per unit. I will be copying down the same cost per unit for 10,000 units as well as 6,000 units. So starting with direct material, cost per unit is 70. So 70 will be mentioned for both the columns. Likewise, direct labor, the cost per unit is 25. I will mention 25 for both columns. And we also have something called as direct variable expense, which is a direct cost at rupees 5. So all of these are my direct costs. So direct costs are variable expense and hence the cost per unit remains the same irrespective of units of production. Now, how do I calculate the amount? I multiply my cost per unit into the respective sets of units. So 70 into 6,000 in case of this column. This gives me the amount. I do the same thing for direct labor and direct expense as well. I take the cost per unit and multiply into the units of production. I do this for both columns. So with this, I'm able to find out my prime cost. The total of my direct expenses will give me prime cost. The first overhead after prime cost will be factory overheads. Now, in the question, they've clearly mentioned what are the variable factory overheads and what are the fixed factory overheads. Variable factory overheads, cost per unit is 20 and fixed factory overheads, the amount is 1 lakh. So I'm going to mention that variable cost per unit is 20, which remains the same irrespective of the units of production, and fixed amount is 1 lakh, which remains the same irrespective of the units of production. Now, all I have to do is find out what is remaining in my calculation. So I need to calculate the amount of variable factory overheads. How do I calculate the amount? Take my units and multiply into the cost per unit. I do this for both columns, 6,000 into 20. And how do I calculate the cost per unit? Take the amount and divide by the units of production. 10 rupees for 10,000 units was already given in the question. For the next column, I take my amount 1 lakh divided by the number of units. That gives me 16.67 per unit. So this added to your prime cost will give you the works cost. Find out the cost per unit by taking the amount and dividing it by the respective units of production. 8,20,000 divided by 6,000 units. So that gives me my works cost. The next overhead we have is office and administration overhead. Now, under office and administration overhead, we only have administration expenses, which is clearly mentioned as fixed at 50,000. Cost per unit is 5. So for 10,000 units, I know the amount is 50,000, cost per unit is 5. Now, since this is a fixed expense, the amount of 50,000 will remain the same even under 6,000 units. To find out cost per unit, I take my amount and divide it by the number of units. And this added to your works cost gives you cost of production. Find out the cost per unit. I'm repeating this calculation at every step so that you all know how to calculate the cost per unit. The next overhead that we have is the selling and distribution overhead. Now we do have selling expenses, which is semi-variable, and distribution expenses, which is semi-variable. So we'll start off with selling expenses. We'll divide it into two portions. One is the fixed portion and one is the variable portion. Now they've only given us the cost per unit, 13 rupees. So let's find out how much is fixed and how much is variable. So let's prepare a working note over here. Okay, in case of selling expenses, the total cost per unit for selling came up to 13, out of which 10% is fixed. So cost per unit is 13. Fixed is 10%. So 10% of 13 is 1.3. So therefore, variable, which is 90%, will come up to 11.7. Okay. So this is how you find out the cost per unit for the fixed portion and variable portion. Now we know that the cost per unit when it comes to the variable cost will remain the same irrespective of the levels of production. So under selling expenses for variable, I'm going to mention 11.7 as cost per unit for both the columns. And according to my 10,000 units information, they've said fixed comes up to 1.3 as cost per unit. But that's going to change for the next set of units because we don't know what is the amount we need to find out. So what you have to do is take the units of production given to you in the question and use that as a base to find out the value for the next column. Now the fixed cost per unit is 1.3. This when multiplied into the units, which is 10,000 units, will give us the amount. Okay, 1.3 into 10,000 units gives us 13,000 as the fixed portion of selling expenses. Now this amount will remain the same even in the next column at 6,000 units. To find out the cost per unit, you take the amount and divide by 6,000 units. So this will be my cost per unit. Whereas for variable portion, I have found out the cost per unit, which remains the same in both columns. Now all I have to do is multiply that cost per unit into the respective units to find out the amount. So I've done the multiplication and I found out the amount. So with this, we found out the variable and fixed portion of selling expenses. I will be doing the same thing in case of distribution expense because this is also a semi-variable cost. The total cost per unit is 7 and the fixed portion is 20%. So let's prepare another working note. This time I will be calculating it for distribution expense. Cost per unit is 7. Fixed portion is 20%. So the variable portion will become 80%. Now 20% of 7 will give me 1.4 and the remaining becomes variable. And this variable cost per unit will remain the same irrespective of the units of production. So 5.6 will be copied down in both the columns because that remains the same. And fixed portion, that's 1.4, is given for this 10,000 units that's mentioned in the question. So I will copy that under 10,000 units. With this, I will be able to find out what is that fixed amount, which I can copy in the other columns. 1.4 into 10,000 units will give me the amount of fixed portion, which remains the same in the other column as well. Now, once you have your units and the amount and cost per unit, you calculate the remaining. Here, I'm going to be finding out cost per unit. So 14,000 divided by 6,000 units. For variable, I will have to find out the amount. So take the cost per unit and multiply into 10,000 units and 6,000 units. Right? So with this, we find out the cost of sales. Find out the cost per unit of cost of sales. Take the amount and divide by the respective units. This 155 was already given in the question. And this is what we are supposed to calculate. So with this, we were able to find out the cost of sales at 6,000 units as well. Thank you.